The world of the 15th century is a rapidly changing one, with the effects of the Renaissance just beginning to affect the European world, and humanists such as Leonardo da Vinci and others begin to change the European mindset. The creation of empires that span over thousands of miles of ocean, and new religion also begin to appear. In the Middle East, the great Ottoman Empire is beginning to form, which will change the course of history until the 1900s with its collapse after the Great War. The 15th century will form a new world through conquering, settling, and trading.
Our historical timeline of the 15th century can be said to begin in the Ming Dynasty of China during the 15th century. The Ming Dynasty had many great achievements from 1368 to 1644. First, the Ming Dynasty wanted to eliminate all signs of foreign rule, discouraging the use of Mongol names in dress while promoting Confucian learning based on earlier models from the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties. Emperor Yongle sponsored an enormous encyclopedia of some 11,000 volumes. Yongle also relocated the capital to Beijing, ordered the building of magnificent imperial residence known as the Forbidden City, and constructed the Temple of Heaven. The Ming Dynasty also re-established a civil service examination system that helped create a more centralized government in China. The state acted quickly to repair the millions of acres that had been neglected by the Mongols. As a result, the economy during the Ming Dynasty rebounded, and both international and domestic trading flourished. Furthermore, China undertook the largest and most impressive maritime expeditions the world had ever seen. There were more than 300 ships for the first voyage, with a crew of around 27,000, which included 180 physicians, hundreds of government officials, 5 astrologers, 7 high-ranking or grand eunuchs, carpenters, tailors, accountants, merchants, translators, cooks, and thousands of soldiers sailing. They had many ports in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, India, Arabia, and East Africa. Many exotic products were brought back to China as a result of these expeditions. For example, ostriches, zebras, and giraffes. However, China did not seek to conquer new territories because they did not want to start local disputes. However, the voyages had an abrupt end, partly due to the death of Emperor Yongle, who had been the chief patron of the enterprise.
The Middle East is beginning to experience a great change, for the Ottoman Empire is beginning to encompass the Middle East, and especially Anatolia, and is rapidly growing in wealth and power under the religion of Islam. Although one must understand the origin of this empire, many of the Anatolian Turks before the creation of the empire saw themselves as Ghazis, or warriors for Islam, and they forced military societies under the leadership of an emir, a chief commander, and followed a strict Islamic code of conduct. Although of these, Osman was the most successful, and people called him Othman in the West, so his followers were given the name Ottomans. He built a small Muslim state in Anatolia between 1300 and 1326, and his successors expanded it by buying land, forming alliances with some emirs, and conquering others. An emir is a title given to some Muslim rulers. One major reason that the Ottomans were so successful at building the empire can be mainly pinpointed on the use of gunpowder, and they were among the first to use cannons as weapons of attack. This gave them sieging power they needed to take down the great walls that existed in the region. The second Ottoman leader, Orkhan I, was Osman's son, and he felt strong enough to declare himself Sultan, or overlord. And in 1361 the Ottomans captured Adrianople, the second most important city in the Byzantine Empire, and with this, a new Turkish empire began to rise. The Ottomans were smart in being benevolent to those they conquered, and they required that Muslims serve in Turkish armies and make contributions required by faith, while non-Muslims were not forced to join, but they had to instead pay a tax. Although not all was successful in the expansion, for a great rebellious leader and conqueror from Central Asia would halt their expansion by the name of Timur the Lame, or as Europeans called him, Tamerlane. He would burn down Baghdad in present-day Iran and defeat Ottoman forces at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. When Timur began to turn his attention to China, war broke out among the 4 sons of the Ottoman Sultan, and of those Mehmed I would reign victorious and claim the throne. His son, Murad II, would defeat the Venetians, Hungary, and the army of Italian crusaders in the Balkans. He was the first of 4 powerful sultans who greatly expanded the Ottoman Empire. His son, Mehmed II, or Mehmed the Conqueror, achieved the greatest victory in Ottoman history by conquering Constantinople, and this would allow them to take control of the Bosporus Strait. Mehmed II's grandson, Selim the Grim, would then take power in 1512 and defeat the Safavids of Persia at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514. He then swept south through Syria and Palestine and into North Africa, securing more of the Mediterranean coastline. He finished his conquests by taking Cairo, which was the intellectual center of the Muslim world at the time. Finally, the Ottoman Empire reached its peak size during the reign of Suleiman the Lawgiver, who was known in the West as Suleiman the Magnificent. He conquered the most important European city of Belgrade in 1521, and the next year they captured the island of Rhodes in the Mediterranean and now dominated the whole eastern portion of the sea. With this new immense power, they were able to capture Tripoli on the coast of North Africa and continue to conquer along the North African coastline. And in 1526, he began to advance into Hungary and Austria, throwing Central Europe into a panic, and his armies pushed to the outskirts of Vienna in Austria. The only person who even came close to rivaling Suleiman's power would be Charles V, head of the Habsburg Empire in Europe. One of Suleiman's greatest achievements was the social structure that he was able to establish under his reign. This included the devshirme system, where the Sultan's army drafted boys from the peoples of conquered Christian territories along the Janissaries, who were trained to be loyal to the Sultan only, and their superb discipline of which made them the heart of the Ottoman war machine. Although despite these great achievements, the Ottoman Empire was losing ground after Selim II inherited the throne, when Suleiman killed his ablest son and drove another into exile. A customary practice for a sultan was to have his brother strangled, and this would create a long line of weak sultans who eventually brought ruin on the empire. However, the empire would last until the early 20th century. On the other hand, in Europe, the Renaissance began in Italy, which was the rebirth or revival of art and learning in Europe, after the long-lasting Dark Age that had existed. Educated men and women of Italy hoped to bring back to life the culture of classical Greece and Rome, yet at the same time create something new. At the time, Italy consisted of mainly city-states, which the bubonic plague had happened to strike hard, killing up to 60% of the population. It is the plague in particular that brought economic changes, since there were fewer laborers and survivors that could demand higher wages, and with few opportunities to expand business, merchants began to invest in other interests such as art. In city-states such as Milan and Florence in northern Italy, a high percentage of citizens could be intensely involved in political life due to their relatively small size. Although merchants dominated politics, they did not inherit a social rank like nobles. One city-state by the name of Florence had come to be a republic, but during the Renaissance, however, the Medici family began to take power. They were a powerful banking family, who branched offices throughout Italy and in the major cities of Europe. The wealthiest in Europe at the time would be part of this family, and he would be known as Cosimo de' Medici. He basically became a dictator in Florence, for while he never assumed political office himself, he chose the ruling council by giving them loans. His grandson Lorenzo de' Medici came to power in 1469, and was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent. He ruled as a dictator, yet kept up the appearance of having an elected government. As scholars in the region studied Roman and Greek manuscripts that were preserved by the Turks who conquered Constantinople in 1453, a new study called humanism began to develop. Humanism was an intellectual movement that focused on human potential and achievements instead of trying to make classical texts agree with the Christian teaching as medieval scholars had. It was humanists that popularized the study of subjects common to classical education such as history, literature, and philosophy, and these subjects are called the humanities as a result. While most people in Italy remained Catholics, the basic spirit of Renaissance society was secular, where they had a worldly rather than spiritual perspective on life. Church leaders during the Renaissance beautified Rome and other cities like it by spending huge amounts of money for art, and they became patrons of the art by financially supporting artists. With the Renaissance, art was completely revolutionized, and the technique of perspective begins to develop, which shows 3 dimensions on a flat surface. 4 important people of the Renaissance in particular include Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Donatello, and Raphael. When said, these names may remind someone of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but it is actually their name that is based off of these people. Leonardo da Vinci was a painter, sculptor, inventor, and scientist. He was the definition of the true Renaissance man, and was interested in how things work. He studied how a muscle moves and how veins are arranged in a leaf, and filled his notebooks with observations and sketches. He would then use these discoveries in his art, and among these masterpieces he created one of the best known portraits in the world, the Mona Lisa. He also produced a famous religious painting known as the Last Supper, which shows Jesus' disciples through facial expression. Donatello made sculpture more realistic by carving natural postures and expressions that reveal personality, and he revived the form in his statue of David. It was the first European sculpture of a large freestanding nude since ancient times. Michelangelo, like Leonardo, was a Renaissance man and excelled as a painter, sculptor, architect, and poet. He is most famous for the way he portrayed the human body in painting and sculpture, and created figures with heroic figure. One of his achievements can be seen in the Dome of St. Peter's, where on the ceiling is a painting on the Sistine Chapel. Raphael, being younger than Leonardo and Michelangelo, studied their works, and among his many works included his painting known as the School of Athens, which conveys the classical influence on the Renaissance. He painted famous Renaissance figures, such as Michelangelo, Leonardo, and himself. Renaissance writers wrote about their own times, but wrote mostly in vernacular instead of Latin, like most literate did at the time before. Often Renaissance writers wrote either for self-expression or to portray the individuality of their subjects, and in these ways they set a standard for modern writers. Petrarch was one of the earliest and most influential humanists, and some even call him the father of Renaissance humanism. He was a great poet who wrote in Italian and in Latin, and he wrote sonnets which were 14-line poems. They were about a mysterious woman named Laura, who was his ideal. Finally, Machiavelli examined the imperfect conduct of human beings and examines how a ruler can gain power and keep it in spite of his enemies. He said that to succeed in a wicked world, a prince must be as strong as a lion and as shrewd as a fox. The Renaissance will spread across Europe and reach England in the mid-1500s when Queen Elizabeth I begins her reign. This age, because of that, is called the Elizabethan Age, and this is when one of the most famous English writers, William Shakespeare, is born. He will go on to become one of the greatest playwrights of all time, and he was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, a small town about 90 miles from London, and by 1592 he was living in London and writing poems and plays that he would soon perform at the well-known Globe Theatre. Like others, Shakespeare referred to the classics and drew upon them for inspiration and plots.
By 1500, the Renaissance emphasis on the secular and the individual challenged church authority. The printing press, created by Johannes Gutenberg, helped spread these secular ideas. Furthermore, some other rulers began to challenge the church's political power. It was difficult for the Pope to impose central authority on Germany because it was divided into many competing states. Spurred by these social, political, and economic forces, a new movement for religious reform began in Germany, which then swept much of Europe. The church's critics claimed that its leaders were corrupt. Many of the priests and monks were so poorly educated that they could barely read, let alone teach people. Others broke their priestly vows by marrying, and some drank to excess or gambled. Martin Luther was becoming a lawyer until he was caught in a terrible thunderstorm. He was certain that he would die, so he cried out and said, "Saint Anne, help me. I will become a monk." He lived through the terrible storm and dedicated his life to become a good Christian. In 1517, Luther met a friar named Johann Tetzel. Tetzel was selling his indulgences, which was a pardon from sin. To Luther, it seemed that Tetzel was buying his way to heaven. In response, Luther wrote the 95 Theses, which attacked the pardon merchants. He posted them on the door of his local church. Rapidly, Luther's name began to be known all over Germany. Soon, Luther wanted to reform the church. The Pope soon realized that Luther was a serious threat to the Catholic Church. Pope Leo X issued a decree threatening Luther with excommunication. Luther did not take back his word, but instead burned the Pope's decree. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V also disliked Luther's teachings. He summoned Luther to the town of Worms to stand trial, but Luther refused. Luther soon discovered that his teachings were already being put to practice. In 1524, German peasants demanded to end serfdom. In response, Luther wrote to the prince urging that he had no mercy against the peasants, which led to the deaths of 100,000 people. As a result, the peasants felt betrayed by Luther. Many German princes joined the forces with the Pope against Luther. However, the princes that supported Luther that protested against the Pope were called Protestants. Charles V went to war against the Protestants and won. However, the Protestants did not return to the Catholic Church. So, Charles V and the Protestants met in Augsburg to settle with a peace agreement. In 1521, Henry VIII, who was a devout Catholic, wrote a stinging attack on Luther's ideas. In 1559, Queen Elizabeth was determined to return her kingdom back to Protestantism. And in 1559, Queen Elizabeth set up the Church of England. Ignatius grew up with his father in his castle in Spain. During war, Ignatius had a great turning point in his life when he got injured. While recovering, he thought about his past sins. In 1522, he began writing a book called Spiritual Exercises that laid out a day-by-day plan for meditation, prayer, and study. For the next 18 years, Ignatius gained followers. The Pope created a religious order for his followers called the Society of Jesus. Their overall goal was to stop the spread of Protestantism. The Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico around 1200 AD. The Aztecs were poor, nomadic people from the harsh deserts in northern Mexico. They soon adapted to local ways, finding work as soldiers for local rulers. Over the years, the Aztecs gradually increased in strength and in numbers. In 1428, they joined two other city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan, to form the Triple Alliance. Religion played a major role in Aztec society. They had approximately 1,000 gods to worship. In 502, a new ruler, Montezuma II, was crowned emperor. Under Montezuma, the Aztec began to weaken. Montezuma called for more sacrifices, but a number of provinces rose up against the Aztec oppression. Like the Aztecs, the Inca built their empire on cultural foundations thousands of years old. They originally lived in a high plateau of the Andes. After wandering for years, they finally settled on the fertile lands in the valley of Cuzco. By the 1200s, they had established their own small kingdom in the valley, under the rule of Pachacuti, who conquered all of Peru. The Inca Empire stretched 2,500 miles long along the western coast of South America. The Inca had a powerful military force, but only used force when necessary. To exercise control over their empire, the Inca built many cities and conquered areas. The Incan state exercised almost total control over economic and social life. They regulated the production and distribution of goods as well. However, the Inca never developed a writing system. History was passed down through oral tradition. Some historians believe that the Incas also developed an elaborate calendar system. In 1532, a conquistador named Francisco Pizarro marched a small force into South America. He had conquered the Incan Empire. Pizarro and his 200 men met with the Incan ruler Atahualpa. The Spaniards ambushed the Incan and crushed them, while kidnapping Atahualpa. Pizarro then marched on the Incan capital Cuzco and captured it without a struggle. As Mali declined in the 1400s, people who had been under its control began to break away. Among them were the Songhai people to the east. They built up an army and extended their territory to the large bend of the Niger River near Gao. They gained control of all important trade routes, and Gao was the capital of their empire. Suni Ali, a Songhai ruler, built a professional army that had a riverboat fleet of war canoes and a mobile fighting force on horseback. He expanded Songhai into an empire through his skills as a military commander and his aggressive leadership. However, the Songhai lacked modern weapons. In 1591, a Moroccan fighting force of several thousand men equipped with gunpowder and cannons invaded Songhai. The Moroccan troops quickly defeated the Songhai warriors and were only armed with spears and swords.